Welcome to the Breath of God. This is a channel dedicated to studying the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So today we're going to continue our study into the life of Apostle Peter. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at Peter's life from the lens of 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. So I'm going to read those verses. So we're looking at Peter's life through the lens of these particular verses and how the Lord shapes Peter's life step by step. So I'm going to read, and this is from the New King James Version. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. So Peter lays out this step-by-step process by which the Lord shaped him from a rugged individual to a disciple to an apostle. So in the first two lessons, we learned how the Lord encountered Peter 3 times, and we saw the emergence of faith. And then in the second lesson, we saw how the Lord shaped Peter and put his goodness, or exposed him to the goodness of the Lord through observing Jesus, practicing what Jesus had taught him, and then we see the Lord provided a unique opportunity for Peter to step out in the goodness of the Lord when the Lord came walking out on the water. So in this next section, we're going to learn about knowledge. How did the Lord grow Peter in knowledge? So these are the 3 areas: faith, goodness, and then knowledge. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at 3 events in the life and ministry of Jesus where the Lord only permitted 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, to have personal knowledge of. So these 3 only had personal knowledge of the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration, and then finally, Jesus took these 3 so they could watch and observe him up close in Gethsemane as he agonized in prayer before going to the cross. And these are the 3 experiences that these 3 were permitted to see. And Peter even references the transfiguration and what an impression that made upon him in his second epistle in that first chapter. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this first experience of the resurrection of the little girl. And I'm reading from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5. My apologies. Oh, here it is. Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. So I'm going to read this narrative. Now, when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, and she may be healed, and she will live." So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now a certain woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians, she had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue house, who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. So you have this first event. Jairus comes to Jesus. He's making his way, and then this woman who has a chronic condition for 12 years, and the little girl, by the way, is 12 years old, and the lady had a bleeding problem for 12 years, so there's a message in that, but I won't go there. And this woman who's chronically ill, and she reaches and she touches Jesus, and she's healed instantaneously. And while this is occurring, some men arrive and say, "Hey, Jairus, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. There's nothing more that can be done. She's gone." And Jesus, hearing that word in the effect it had on Jairus, he takes hold of Jairus, looks at him, and says, "Don't be afraid, just believe." So they get there to Jairus' house where the dead girl is. And Jesus says, she's just sleeping, because to Jesus, death is nothing but sleep, for which a person can be awoken from. And he takes only three of his disciples into the space with the mother and the father. And in that place, and then Jesus removed all the people who didn't believe. So he removed the the unbelieving individuals from the room. They were not going to contribute to the environment of the miracle. So Jesus speaks to the little girl, basically says, little girl, get up. She gets up, she comes back to life, and he says, hey, don't tell anybody about this, and by the way, give her something to eat. So you see this first miracle. Jesus invites his three, and they witness this little girl who's so fragile, and the agony of their mother and father in losing their little girl, and he raises her to life with just a phrase, and the disciples witness this. And when I thought about, there were other resurrections, Lazarus's resurrection, and Jesus didn't do this. But what you see here is Jesus is teaching these disciples about sacred spaces and how to create a sacred space and invite the presence and power of God into any circumstance. So this was a place of death and despair, and Jesus enters in, and his three disciples who believed in the Lord, they had a measure of faith. They invited the presence and the power of God into this house. And the Lord manifests his presence and raises the little girl from the dead. So this, I believe, is what he was trying to help them to learn, as these would be the early leaders of the church. These would be the top three leaders of the church, Peter, James, and John. So let's go to the next example. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining and exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launder on earth can whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one but only Jesus with themselves. Now as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen, till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. I'll stop here in verse 10. So you see this other event. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John on a high mountain, just these three, and he is transfigured. We see the glory of Jesus made manifest, his clothing, his face, everything. And Moses and Elijah appear as representatives of the law and the prophets, and even God himself speaks here. And you see the disciples, these three, got to see Jesus in his glory. They got a preview. And they were the only three that were witness to this. And Peter mentions this in his second epistle in the first chapter, and the impression it made on him. So again, this is one of these sacred spaces. God shows up and they have an encounter with the Lord here on a high mountain. And for these three, I think this particular experience that they were privy to helped them to see beyond the suffering. So these three would suffer tremendously for the gospel. James would be the first to die a martyr's death. Then Peter, according to church tradition, would have to watch his wife be martyred, and then he was later martyred, crucified upside down the same day, according to Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius. So, and then John would bear the cost of his convictions. He would be the last of the apostles to die. And he would be, the Romans would actually attempt to kill him multiple times, and he survives, and he's the last of the apostles. And so these three were the tip of the spear for Jesus' ministry. So they needed themselves a knowledge that would carry them through the suffering. So they needed to be able to see beyond the suffering to the joy, the glory that was ahead of them. And that was seen in the person of Christ. That was seen in the presence of God coming down and being manifest in the voice and in the cloud. And then, two individuals, Moses and Elijah. So their brothers, the prophets, they would see again. And they needed this image, this special experience to lead the church through suffering to glory. So he gives them this special experience. They were the only ones, like I said, that had knowledge of this event. And Jesus forbade them to speak of it until after his resurrection. And I think the reason why the Lord had told them not to speak about it, very similar to what he did with Jairus' daughter. He told the parents not to speak of it, was he wanted them to think about, to contemplate what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had felt when they were in that place. They were to ruminate on that and allow themselves to reflect deeply. One of the things that happens when you experience something and then you talk about it right away, sometimes you lose it, actually. You miss the deeper meaning. You need to sit with it for a little while before you share it. And these disciples were to wait to share this until after he rose from the dead. And then they didn't even know what he meant by rising from the dead. So they did. They sat on this, and then they shared this experience later. And now the third experience that these three had was they all three were the only ones who got an intimate, up-close view of the agony of Messiah at Gethsemane. So I'm going to read from these verses. This is Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42. So I'm going to read these 10 verses. Then they came to the place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." He went a little further and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." Then he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Can you not watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed and spoke the same words, and when he returned he found them asleep again. For their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Then he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So the Lord comes to Gethsemane and he separates his disciples and he takes these three, Peter, James, and John, to the place where he is going to agonize and wrestle in prayer. And he goes a little bit farther from them, but it's these three that have the most intimate view of Jesus's agony in Gethsemane. And again, I think this was important for these three because they were going to be the tip of the spear in the church, and they needed to know what was ahead of them, and they needed to see how their Lord walked out the will of God. They saw the agony. They saw Jesus struggling in prayer, wrestling with his own humanity, and coming out fully in a place of submission to the will of the Father to take on the sin of the world. They would see the Son of Man, who is God and perfect in every way in his humanity. Even he had to wrestle and agonize in prayer, that he himself prayed to the Father, even though he is the eternal Son. And this gave them an example of what they would have to do themselves. It would require agonizing, praying, wrestling it out with the Father. Not my will, but your will be done. He was giving them a preview of coming attractions. This is what they would walk through. They would follow him into Gethsemane, to that place as leaders where they would have to come before the Father and wrestle it out. So this was an important lesson that they needed to learn in order to lead. And what you find in these apostles is they were men of prayer. You find them, in the early church. What were they doing in the upper room? They created a sacred space. They changed Mary's home into a temple, essentially, and they gathered there and they prayed. And you find them devoting themselves to the ministry of God's word and to prayer. You also find them everywhere they go, they turned it into a sacred space. So you see, you see similar healings. There was a lady named Dorcas in the book of Acts, and Peter goes up there and raises her from the dead in her room. And so you find that they even turned the prisons into sacred spaces of worship. So it was this experience, this learning around sacred spaces. And these three were, like I said, the tip of the spear. And they saw Jesus turn a little girl's room into a sacred place where the manifest presence of God showed up. They saw Jesus transfigured in the glory of the Father. And Moses and Elijah, he turned that mountain became a sacred space. And when we see Jesus in Gethsemane, he turned that into a sacred space where he met the Father. And this was the lesson. This is how they themselves would lead. And these were to be the men who brought and invited the manifest presence and power of God into any place. And this was the learning for them. And this was how the Lord trained them up as apostles. So that's the lesson. So that's the addition of knowledge, which is all about apostolic sacred spaces. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson. And next time we're going into self-control and perseverance. And this covers the 52-day period from Jesus' crucifixion to the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So we'll cover this 52-day period next, and we're going to learn about self-control and perseverance. So next time, thank you, and remember, His breath is our calling. Have a great day. Bye.